Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Season 2 of Barnyards and Backyards Live. We are happy to be here. I'm Jeff Edwards for the University of Wyoming Extension. Along with me today is Jeremiah Vardaman. He is also from the University of Wyoming Extension. Good morning, Jeremiah.
Good morning. How are we doing?
Great. Good to see you. And
to see you.
also, you will be occasionally hearing, but probably not seeing, Jenny Thompson. She is also part of University of Wyoming Extension, and she is helping us run the show. So she is vitally important to this project. And finally, I'd like to introduce our guest today. This is Amy Seiler, and to make sure that I get this correct, just a second, she is the Director of Parks and Recreation and Leisure Services for the city of Gering, Nebraska. And she wanted me to let you know that if you thought, why would we want to be listening to her today? Her degree is from UNL in horticulture and landscape design. So welcome, Amy. Good to see you.
Thank you. I am so delighted to have the invitation to be here today and can't wait to visit about all things tree related today.
We're very excited to have you here today too. We always enjoy chat with you. So before we get started, a couple of ground rules with Facebook. For those of you who have not participated with us before, or maybe not familiar with Zoom, if you have a question and if you scroll your mouse over the top of the Zoom page, at the bottom there's a chat button and there's a Q&A button. If you have a question or a comment for Amy or for any of us, use those two buttons and we will bring those questions forward to Amy during her presentation. And if you are joining us via Facebook Live, just enter a comment or in the comment field, enter your question, and one of us, Jenny or myself, will bring that question forward to Amy. And hopefully we will have a good discussion this morning. So I think, Jeremiah, did I hit everything?
We're good to roll. Let's do
Excellent. Yeah. All right. So without further ado, Amy, I'm turning the floor over to you and let's get going.
All right. I am so excited. Well, Jeff and I have had the opportunity to visit quite a bit, doing a radio show for Goshen County, and we always love to talk trees and all the good stuff and some of the bad stuff that goes on with trees. And so I thought today would be a really good opportunity, as it's a bit chilly, though out here in Western Nebraska, it's going to be about 50 degrees. We could talk about what are some of the things that we need to do with our trees in the winter to ensure that they are healthy and doing well in the summer. And so I thought I'd just share some things that we need to be thinking about or getting on our to-do list. And so let me share my screen with you.
Well, and I think this is going to be really timely because this, at least for me up here in the northwest part of Wyoming, is just it's an unusual winter, right? It's just really mild. It's not our typical winter. We don't get much snow cover here that lasts, and we don't have any snow cover this year. So there might be some things we need to do differently this type of winter than we would in other winters.
Well, and I think we've had some really significant wind events this year that cause problems for trees. So we may be talking about that as well.
we better, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And we really should be. So I think that Jeremiah touched on something. This has been a very unique year. The last few winters, we've had incredible snow cover, and it started in November, and we've been blessed to have it really insulating our tree roots all through the winter up until maybe mid-February. And as you both have mentioned, we haven't seen that this year. What's been really unique is that we out here in Western Nebraska had a freeze on September 8th, I believe 8th or 9th, and it got significantly cold, about 27 degrees for that early in the season. So that was the first little thing that kind of did a little number on our trees. And then not only did we have that cold weather event, but we had incredibly cold temperatures the first part of October, where we got down to, I think, like 8 and 4 degrees. I might be making this up because we had the same thing happen last year,
right.
But that was extremely impactful. Now that I think about it, I think that event happened more towards, like October 17th. Irregardless, 0 degrees or close to it at that time of year is not good for our trees, particularly because we had very warm temperatures. So these trees had not really initiated some of those processes to kind of start shutting down and changing the chemistry within the tree to handle colder weather. So
basically they didn't have a chance to like start winterizing within them and prep for that, right? They were still in the active growing, normal growing season. Is that a fair statement, Amy?
I think for some trees, particularly the ones that need those cold temperatures to initiate that shutdown, some start that process because of shorter day lengths, but others, they need those colder temperatures. And frankly, none of, like ash is usually really good about starting to shut down its processes, but they were fully leafed out, hadn't even thought about changing colors right up until it got really cold. And as I'm sure most of you noticed, when it froze the next day, all those ash trees, all those leaves were on the ground and they were all still green. They hadn't even thought about the chlorophyll hadn't even really left the leaf yet. So it's been a number. So
they were waving the white flag.
They were. They're like, they were probably like, I'm so over this year. So we had a late freeze. It was blazing hot this summer. It never rained. And then they have these weather events. They're like, just get me into dormancy because I'm over it. So,
and what that would do, right, is just kind of shock the tree and put it into a little bit of a stress right before it goes into dormancy, which we don't ideally want. Mm-hmm. However, we don't have much control of that.
Well, and going into dormancy is kind of a stressor on a tree anyway, because they're using so much energy to prepare to drop their leaves. They're pulling nutrients back into the stems. They're working on abscising those leaves, which means that they are creating that little tiny callus tissue, kind of shutting off the water to the leaf. And so that's a lot of work for the tree. And when it's not able to do that normally, that is a double whammy to it. So I'd say what we need to talk about today is very important. Is let's first think about how are we going to care for our trees this winter, and what should we do? So Jeremiah had mentioned how dry and that we have no snow cover. So what that really speaks to us is that we need to be watering our trees. And my typical practices, irregardless of if it's a normal year or a unnormal year like this, is I like to water my trees if we don't have any snow cover once a month. And for me to remember when to do it, I try to do it on holidays. So if we haven't had a good October snow, I like to water my trees in November around Thanksgiving. I always put a bunch of water, particularly around my evergreens, all around their drip zone around Thanksgiving. And then if we continue to have an open, dry, early winter, then I will water them around Christmas, maybe around the 1st of January. Then I think, okay, Martin Luther King Day, I might get a little bit of water on them. And then President's Day in February, I like to make sure that I get some water on them around President's Day. And then March, I have no holiday. But,
St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, yes, thank you. What's wrong with me? St. Patrick's Day, yes. Thank you, Jeff. I'll put that on my calendar. And then, hopefully by that time we've had some moisture. This year we haven't. And so my trees have got a dose of water actually 2 to 3 times since they've lost their leaves, just because it's been so warm, so dry, and so windy. I want to make mention to you, when we're talking about watering, what we want to do is, I would say, let's focus on our trees that could be damaged the most by these warm, dry temperatures. And that would be our evergreens. That would be our pines, our spruce trees, those that still hold their leaves, and they are still losing moisture out of that needle. So I like to make sure that I get a good soaking on those trees. And what I like to do is I have an image right in front of you. And this just kind of reminds us where our roots are in our trees. And so, and you can see my cursor. And this is a deciduous tree, of course, but our evergreens would be very similar. Just kind of think of that pyramidal form. You want to make sure that you get moisture into our soil profile about 8 to 12 inches down, because most of our trees, most of their roots are in the top 0 to 18, maybe 24 inches of soil. That all depends on the tree species that it is. It depends on your soil type. And so I really like to do a pretty good soaking. And so how do you do that? I like to bring a hose out. And as you look at this image, we don't want to bring our hose out and lay it right here at the trunk of the tree. These are a lot of our nice big lateral anchoring roots that are up here. There's not a lot of smaller roots that'll do a lot of that water absorbing. And so we can get a little bit of water around in this area, but where we really need to focus is right here at the edges of our drip line of our trees. This is where a lot of our roots that will uptake water, that's where they are growing. And so I like to take a hose, and actually I put a little tiny fountain sprinkler on the end of my hose, and I will just set it out here and let it water. Now, what I do want to make mention is and I think this is probably a no-brainer for most of us, you don't want to water if the ground is frozen, because it's ineffective. Most of it, if not all of it, will run off. Our soils aren't frozen right now because it's been so warm and dry. So I think that you will have some good absorption of moisture. So basically what I do is I would just set that hose and do it in quarters. I water over here for about maybe an hour at a low soak, and then I'd move it into this quarter section and then move it to this quarter section, trying to make sure that I get the majority of that root zone watered. And I try to do that once a month, and it takes some time. It definitely takes some time, but it's a great investment, particularly for my evergreens, because I can tell when they are getting a little dry and stressed. And so I try to get some water on them. And that appearance, when I say what that looks like, is that needle will appear kind of an off, not a deep green color, but kind of an off green color. And this is an indicator to me that it's losing too much moisture out of the plant.
That's great, Amy. You actually answered our first question that came in from Thomas, and he was reading my mind. That is exactly what I was going to bring up is, so if that ground is frozen, we don't want to be watering on it because the water's not getting into the ground and into our trees. So do you have a method for determining how frozen the ground is?
Absolutely.
Do you use air temperature? Do you have any other method?
Oh, mine is really scientific. I have about a 12-inch long screwdriver. And if I am able to get that down in the ground about 6 to 12 inches, that's an indicator to me that that soil profile, there's enough room in that I would be able to get water into that where the tree could eventually absorb it and utilize it. So my super scientific way is that screwdriver. Also, I usually do not water unless the temperatures are between 45 and 50 degrees, or that's my lowest temperature. Obviously, if it's in the 60s, I'm certainly going to be looking at getting some water on it, but I usually don't water when it's cooler than 45 degrees outside.
Now with your screwdriver method, now are you bringing out the sledgehammer to make sure it gets down there? Are you just using your hand to push it in? Do you use a hammer at all to try and get a little bit of force on it? How do you do that?
Well, okay. So in the summer, I would, if I had to use any force at all, that would be an indicator to me that I need to get water in the soil. But in the winter, it's a little bit different because you're going to guess that there might be a little tiny bit of frost here and there. So I just use my brute strength and push it down in there. And if I can get it in somewhat easily, then I'm feeling pretty good about water going. It's a totally different philosophy from determining if you need to water in the summer, but I try to use my strength to get that down in there and see if it needs it. Now, I will tell you, I have my park staff go out and determine if they need to be doing any watering during the winter. And it in different locations in our landscapes, it's going to look completely different. So we have a new plaza in Gearing, Nebraska, and we have a lot of young plants. And so we're keeping our eye on when should we be watering, because we don't want to overwater these plants in the winter either, because we don't want water sitting on those roots and having some of those roots rot out. So my staff actually went in and did a little digging, because I was pretty certain that we were pretty dry in our plaza. We have about 4 inches of mulch over our plantings, and they had kind of scheduled a day to water, and they came back and said, Amy, there is moisture in the ground at least 12 inches, and we could dig down 12 inches because the ground is not frozen. And they said it's almost too wet right now. And that was in one section of our plaza. Now we have new pine trees in another section, and you can hardly get the screwdriver in the ground because it's so dry. It's not frozen. It's just rock hard dry. And so you can't just stick that screwdriver in one location and determine that's what it's going to be for your entire landscape, because different exposures and different plants are going to be utilizing that water differently.
Sure.
Right. So now with the applying water, are there certain trees we got to be more concerned about? You already talked about our evergreens. It's kind of one of our first priorities to get water to. But what about maturity or age of the tree? Are we more concerned about younger trees than older trees? And then where do these deciduous trees fit in?
Jeremiah, I'm so glad that you brought that question up. That is such a good question. And our younger trees are going to need more water than our mature trees, because our mature trees are able to, they have a larger area where they're able to pull up that moisture from. Those young trees, especially if you just planted them last fall, they have very limited root establishment, and those root balls are a different soil medium than the soil around them, and they generally dry out more quickly than the native soils around them. So your young trees, I would say between 1 and 5 years old, you're probably going to need to water those more frequently than our larger, older trees.
Great. Awesome. So what, after watering, we've got our watering down, we've been out and assessing that. What's our next line of consideration?
All right, let's see what we, let me see if my screen, there we go. Okay, so we have gotten that moisture back into the soil. And so how do you retain that moisture? And the best way to do that is just ensuring that we have a good mulch around our plants. And I'll refer to this as not just our trees, but all of our plants really could utilize a nice mulch, because what it's going to do is it's going to help regulate our soil temperatures. So we're not having this crazy freeze thaw cycle, which is always a little detrimental to our trees, because sometimes it can initiate coming out of dormancy a little too early, and then these plants will then incur a freeze later in the winter time because they came out of dormancy too soon. So I think mulching, after we get that watering done this year, I think one of the priorities should be making sure that your plants are mulched well. And there are so many different types of mulches that you can use. And in front of you, you'll see that I have a list of mulches that I really like. And I'm just going to kind of touch on a few of these and maybe where they should be used.
Great. Wait right there, Amy. I got a quick question.
Okay, go for it.
So getting back to the watering with our mulching. So should I be pulling my mulch back away to water and then putting that mulch back down? Or what are you talking about there? Can I water over top my mulch? What's the best practice there?
You should water over the top of your mulch if you have the right kind of mulch. And Sometimes some of our shredded mulches will, they will bind together so much that it actually repels moisture. And so when you're out watering, you really need to, maybe after 10 minutes, you might want to go out and just take a look and see how much water is actually soaking through some of those shredded mulches. And it's the shredded mulch is the one that I'm concerned with. And frankly, that should be an indicator to us that maybe we don't want to use that mulch as often in our landscapes, because it does prevent water from soaking in as much as just a chipped mulch. But going back to just pulling it back, I don't like to pull it back because it's kind of stuck to the ground, and when you kind of disturb it, then that in these windy days, when it's disturbed, it will tend to blow more and you'll lose more of your mulch. So I like to kind of keep it in place, but that's just my personal experience. Jeff, Jeremiah, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So because we're so windy, I actually prefer shredded pine mulch because it's cheap and it's available, or cheaper than a lot of things. And it doesn't blow away for me. So when I'm watering, I try to make sure that it's getting through that mulch, because I know that it is kind of a thick, woven together mat. So it's one of those things to keep in mind.
Yeah, same thing. I think all of Wyoming, same with Western Nebraska. We just get such good winds, and the finer the particle size, the harder it is to hold in place. And definitely disturbing it just fluffs it back up and gets it so it's more able to move and travel. And so, yeah, I 100% agree with you. The other thing that we see, and I don't want to steal any of your glory here, Amy, but a lot of times I see people lay down a plastic or a landscape fabric and then put mulch on top of it. And that really seems to accelerate how quickly that mulch gets to Nebraska.
Yep. Thank you.
Another thing I wanted to mention is we also in Laramie, since we have the lovely winds as well, is we use that kind of shredded type too. And I find that watering it with a hose rather than a sprinkler sometimes will get the water down through it a little better, because the top mulch doesn't have as much time or space to absorb the water that's coming from the sprinkler. So we've tried that and it seems to help a bit.
Just turning your hose on to a pencil-sized diameter stream of water and laying it near the tree seems to work fairly well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to just kind of go off on a tangent really quickly on that. So there's been a lot of research out there in regards to mulching, and what the data is telling them is that a chipped hardwood mulch that has many different particle sizes is probably your best mulch. Now, I totally hear what everybody's saying about the wind blowing all of our mulch away. So one way to remedy your mulches blowing away, and I think it's actually part of a healthy ecosystem in your landscape, is that underneath your trees, plant a ground cover. Because I'm always trying to mimic what nature is doing, because frankly, I think nature does it best. I think they do it much better than I do generally. And very seldom do you see in the forest just litter and no plant material. A lot of times that plant material, the ground covers, different things are growing around the drip line of the tree, and they're keeping a lot of that material underneath the tree so that it can retain it and utilize it. And so I like to have ground cover that holds my mulch down a little bit, and then that also prevents it from blowing away. Plus, it's also going to help me collect a little bit of leaf litter and just other organic material that's really going to benefit the tree down the road. And not down the road, but just in general.
Along the mulch questions or discussion, we have a question from Facebook from Miriam, and she'd like to know if using bark mulch or any of the mulches, does it actually steal nitrogen from the soil?
Oh, definitely. Initially, when it is breaking down, that's part of that process. That some of that nitrogen is going to be pulled out, but then it will be released. And if you have mulch breaking down at different stages, I would assume now that it would distribute that okay. But yes, there is definitely, as that mulch is breaking down, there will be a time where some of that nitrogen is pulled away. But let's think about, trees need nitrogen, but trees need all those other minor elements as well. And sometimes we don't need to be crazy concerned about huge loads of nitrogen, because we don't want our trees growing like we want our vegetable plants growing, very rapidly, putting on lots of vegetative growth. We want them to have a slow, consistent growth rate during the growing season. Because that just allows that tree to, first of all, insects love tons of new vegetative growth that nitrogen initiates, and therefore we don't want huge doses of nitrogen around our trees anyway.
Great, Amy, getting back to the ground cover. So what do you recommend for the ground cover? Does it, do we want shallow rooted ground cover? Do we want deep rooted? I've heard that grass roots are very competitive with trees. So this is a question, I believe, coming from Facebook. So can you go a little bit slightly into depth of what type of plants would count as ground cover and what we'd want to kind of select for in a quick manner?
Okay, well, in the image that you're looking at, that green grass would be the least desirable ground. I mean, that's the one that makes the most sense to keep anything from blowing away. But when I am doing ground covers, I'm going to be looking at, so let's use pine let's like in this image, this pine is limbed up a little bit. So I think, okay, what would grow under pine that would be beneficial and maybe symbiotic? And we have some mahonias out in our Wildcat Hills that are a little ground cover that grows at the base of a lot of the pine trees that could spread and cover. We could even use a ground cover shrub like a Growlow sumac. That might be a good ground cover that is certainly going to keep that mulch there. When you're talking deep and shallow rooted, there is going to be some competition, and that's why I always use, not always is such a strong word, I wish that I was always so good about this, but I try to, again, look at what companion plants are in nature and kind of pair them up a little bit, because it's working in nature, so I'm pretty sure it's probably going to work in my yard. So I'll reference the Wildcat Hills again. They have some 3-leaf sumac. Now that's not necessarily a ground cover, but when we're talking ornamental horticulture, we could go Growlow sumac. That would be very similar. Wouldn't you know it? So this is not like fresh in my mind, all the species names. There would be, if we're talking in our landscapes, I like to use, this is not native at all, but like some little lamiums that will really cover the ground. There is a snow and summer that I use that covers the ground really well and holds the mulch and shades the roots and keeps the roots of the tree cool. And there's limited competition, I believe. So those would be two that I would suggest offhand. I probably should have been a little more prepared thinking of other plans.
I think we went off on a tangent on us, right? But
we'll get to throw lefts at you here every once in a while.
So Amy, we have a follow-up question for that. Do you have any recommendations for ground cover specifically for fruit trees?
Oh, no, I don't, because I am not that well versed in fruit trees. I wish that I could be more helpful on that. I do not. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And my apologies.
Oh, that's okay.
No worries.
I think if they would like to do a little research on that topic, there's some effort done by New Mexico State University of planting in between fruit growing species. So that might be something that they can go look up.
The little bit I've seen on it, not to take up more time, but just the vetches So that looking for some of those species
Oh,
that
yeah.
fixate nitrogens, and then some just annual or even perennial flowers. Probably mostly like a perennial in there, so you're not disturbing the root mass too much on the tree, but just to drive pollinators into the area, especially around cross-pollination plant or fruit trees such as apples, something like that. So, but anyway, I don't see any more questions at this point, so let's get back onto mulches and talking about that, Amy.
Okay, well, and thanks for all those great questions. And I always appreciate those questions because it really makes me think. Good direction to go, especially with those fruit trees. I like that. So okay, back to the mulches. So I just want to touch really quickly on a mulch that we are trying. Again, it's in our new Civic Plaza in Gearing, and I've utilized this practice in my own home landscape, but we've done it on a larger scale now at our Civic Plaza, and that's the first mulch on the top of our list, which is a pine straw mulch. And we all are very fortunate. We are living around a lot of pine forests, and so in theory, we could collect a lot of pine straw. You'll probably be disgusted with us. We actually brought our pine straw in for our Civic Plaza from Augusta, Georgia. It's loblolly pine, and I forget the other pine, but it's a short needle and a long needle pine that kind of works together. And we have utilized that all over in our plaza. And I cannot tell you how pleased I am with the product. Now, I will tell you, when we first put it down, it looked like a really bad hair day for our plaza. It was totally crazy. And I think pretty much everybody in our community probably thought, has she lost her mind? This looks horrendous. Fortunately, we got a nice snow about 2 weeks after applying it, and which really settles it down. And it has been a phenomenal mulch for us. Just in a couple little spots, it has blown. And the way that it blows, you'll be entertained by this. It kind of just rolls up. So it doesn't blow away completely. It just kind of rolls up. And so that you can go back out and roll it back out, and then kind of water it down a little bit, and it will stay for you. But we are extremely pleased. And the reason that we like the pine straw, it's great for trees, but it's also very friendly around your perennials. A lot of times with your shredded mulches and your chipped mulch, sometimes you will get a lot of mortality on some of those sensitive perennials because it retains too much moisture and you have crown rot on the plants. And sometimes when the wind blows those mulches, it will cover up those crowns. And so what we found with the pine straw is it stays really well. The water moves through it beautifully. It is just, it's just the right size where it can filter in through all those little needles. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have good moisture in the plaza, is because we've got this about 3-inch thick layer of mulch out there, and it's doing a really nice job of retaining the moisture. So
I got to ask you, Amy, just for the naive people such as myself, when you're saying pine straw, you are actually meaning pine needles. Is that correct?
So see the picture right in front of you. That is actually pine needles. And there's probably a little bit of shredded mulch that's underneath this, but this is pine needles. So let me tell you a little story. This was kind of fun. My neighbor has a ton of pine trees in their yard, tons of them. And every year they would go out and rake up all of their pine needles under their trees, and they would stick them in the dumpster. And then I would go to the dumpster and I would dumpster dive all of those pine needles out, and I would put them around all of my plants, and they stayed really well. It looked really nice. It really helped keep the weeds down. And my neighbor finally said, I don't think I'm going to rake those up anymore. They use them now, and they don't mulch at all. They just allow the pine straw, those pine needles, to sit and protect the soil. And frankly, it's exactly what the tree wants to recycle anyway. So it's really beneficial.
Great.
Questions we get frequently when we talk about pine needle mulch is, Is it too acidic? Will it affect the plant? Those types of things. And
Will it
if you
change the pH of the
will
soil,
it
right?
change the pH of the soil? If you want to talk about that a little bit, Amy, we'd appreciate it.
I wish it would change the pH of the soil like
Don't we?
dramatically. I would be so happy because I don't know about you guys, but ours is like 7.8, 7.9. So if it significantly changed it, I would use it in everything. The studies out there have shown it does not alter the pH much at all, and particularly because we are irrigating and we have so much alkali in our water that it doesn't make a long-term difference, frankly. So I wish that it did. And they say, you know, one of the wives' tales is like, oh, pine needles kill everything underneath it. Things aren't growing under trees sometimes because there's so much shade, and those trees are utilizing so much water that it's not available for a lot of those little plants to grow.
And
Anyway,
Amy,
so
yep. You, sorry to interrupt you. You also made referred to being limbed up. This tree was limbed up. Can you explain what that means as well?
oh, most definitely. And I apologize for not explaining that. I'll, and this can be on deciduous trees like oaks, or it could be on conifer trees like pines or spruce. When you start to remove those lower bottom branches, because particularly conifers, they like to have their branches go all the way down to the ground because it insulates, it shades the roots, it does, and it keeps the competition away. So when you limit up, you're actually removing those bottom branches so that more sunlight can get underneath there. And a lot of times we do that because we want to mow underneath there, or tumbleweeds get caught underneath the pines. And so if you think that, oh, I'll get rid of my tumbleweed problem by just cutting all my branches up, that's called limbing it up.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
So should I also, with the mulching, I'm thinking of these organic mulches, is there any advantage to mixing these mulches? So you talked about maybe a shredded underneath the pine straw. Should I put my grass clippings on top? Should I layer it like that? Should I stick with one? Do I need to mix it? Any thoughts that way?
You know, I just think so technically, I don't think it matters if you mix it, because in the forest, as things are breaking down, you're going to have bigger chunks, and you might have some things that break down more quickly, and you're going to have some leaf litter, and all of that is going to kind of mix together naturally. But when we're talking about our home landscapes, a lot of times what we used to practice is when people really loved like a shredded redwood, but they couldn't afford it, and they knew that they needed to put on 3 to 4 inches, they'd put a base layer of like a chipped mulch. And then they would put like an inch layer of shredded redwood just so that it would look appealing in the landscape. I don't think either one of those things is detrimental, but I will go back to what we talked about earlier. You need to make sure that whatever you're doing, that you can get water to move through that mulch. And that leads me to that the grass clippings, using grass clippings as mulch. You want to make sure that if you use grass clippings, they're not wet, they're not fresh, they need to be dry, and those also can become hydrophobic. And so you want to make sure that they're not building this crusty layer that prevents any water from getting into the soil. So if anything, grass clippings I might mix, but grass clippings a lot of times are probably going to have some potentially, unless you live in the Seiler yard and we don't spray for dandelions, but they're going to have some 2,4-D residue potentially, or some dicamba, and that will break down into the soil. And you just want to make sure that you don't want that around your tree roots, because that could be another stressor on them.
Great. So your conversation just brought some questions to mind for me. You're talking about you want to make sure that that mulch will drain, get water to it. What about inorganic mulches? I see a lot of landscapes with rock, with the landscape fabric. We call it volcano mulching, where they pile the rock up, good 6 to 12 inches, maybe 18 inches up the trunk of the tree. What about that? Is that a good option, especially in the wintertime kind of concept?
Okay, so let's touch on that inorganic mulches first, and then we'll just kind of talk really quickly about mulching methods. So inorganic mulches, I think we all agree that where we all live, the wind blows. And so sometimes you have to look at some alternatives to wood mulch because you've just lost your mind raking all the mulch out of your yard for the 50th time in a month. So I understand that sometimes those inorganic mulches need to be used, and just to kind of hold the soil too. So I think you have to be thoughtful about what you're planting in those inorganic mulches. So you're going to need to plant something that can handle the heat a little bit more, because they're going to absorb that heat, and there will be a pretty good wood mulches kind of keep the temperatures regulated. Sometimes our inorganic mulches aren't as good as organic mulches doing that. So I think you need to be pretty thoughtful. This image right up on top right here, those are some big chunks of rock. You can use that. I think the weed management and that would be horrific. I would be traumatized, but it's holding a slope. It's there's the plant material that's in there is acclimated to living in those kind of conditions for the most part, because I'm looking at, I think that's some rabbit brush and some scrub oak in there, and those can live in that type of environment. Down on the bottom, this one, that is such a bleak appearance. That's a pea gravel. I'm going to show you a good example of how that can be utilized. These are okay. Cobblestone pea gravel, I'm okay with. The landscape fabric, I know that they use that in tree rows, and I fully understand why they do it. It's to reduce the competition when the trees are young, but that landscape fabric needs to be removed, or at least as the trees develop, you need to make sure that fabric doesn't girdle the trunks of the trees. That has happened quite a bit in windbreak projects where the landscape fabric has not broke down and has grown into the trunks of the trees. And then you start having all these nice 15-year-old pine trees start to snap at the base, and it's because of that from the landscape fabric. Rubber mulch, I don't know if I would ever use rubber mulch, but you should never say never. There may be some use for it, but I can't reference any. And tumbled glass, that's just I think if you're just only about looks and not about a complete ecosystem, you could utilize some of that. I want to show you all an example quickly of, this is a planting in front of my house. I've been working on this with the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum for about, oh my goodness, almost 8 years now. And it's a gigantic island. It's about 200 feet long and about 40 feet wide. And the entire thing was covered in pea gravel. And there were about 10 pine trees planted in it. And that was it. And I moved up to this area, and I thought, I don't want to look at that for the rest of my life. So
But Amy, you didn't have to mow it.
Great point. But it could grow puncture vine like no other, let me tell you. And that is a lovely little ground cover until it produces its seed. So what you're going to see in this image is this is the top image is the first year that we planted it. And you're going to notice that this is all gravel mulch. Now, what I did is in this section right back here, I did mix in some pine needles from one of our parks projects, and just a small area, we kind of tried to work it into this gravel. And honestly, this gravel is about 8 inches thick. And wow. So I was planting in basically just gravel for some of these plants. But as you can see in the bottom image, this was planted in 2012, right up on top. this bottom image, I took that this fall. This was 2020. And I don't think that you can ever make the argument that planting stuff in gravel is detrimental for plants, because it's the plants that we've selected. They absolutely love the drainage. That pea mulch, actually, when we dig down in it, there is a nice amount of moisture, about always in the soil, but even the pea gravel will retain some moisture lower in the profile of the pea gravel. And so I want to make an argument. The right plants in pea gravel will do extremely well, and probably better than they would do in an organic wood mulch. And you just kind of need to know where stuff will grow.
Great. I think we better move on, Amy. We're running a little short on time, and I think you wanted to cover pruning, and we do have a question of what is the best time of year to prune your trees. So I think we better jump to that.
Oh, well, perfect.
Fortunately, Tara has jumped in on Facebook and provided a link to some documents. So in case we weren't able to get to it, it's been covered. So please continue.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Tara, for doing that. I greatly appreciate it. So I think everybody hates a bad pruning job. And in the image before you, that is what happens when we don't know what we're doing on pruning. And obviously that's a big tree. And I think you generally want to leave these big types of pruning cuts to professionals when you can. Always use a certified arborist, but it's really important when our trees are small. This is our opportunity to get to be impactful on the overall shape and form of our trees, and which will benefit them down the road. So everybody, I'm going to try this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just bear with me, everybody. Hold on. Okay.
So right, Amy, as you're transitioning, could that one prune cut that has the chip out of the bottom of it, could it have been a result of some damage during a bad storm, and that was their best option to take that limb off?
Oh, Jeff, you're such a positive person. Oh, I'm sure that it could, but that was not the case in that situation. That was not using the 3-cut pruning method. Which, if we have time, we'll get into it. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So everybody, I just want to quickly go over just some little pruning practices. So I have a branch that I have cut from one of our landscapes. Tell me if it shows up well, or how does this look for everybody? Jeff, does it look okay for you, or is it?
We can see it, but I think if you could, yes, move in closer. Yes, it's fine.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, what I want to say is when you're pruning timing is incredibly, I'm just going to flip my screen for a second. Pruning timing is incredibly important. The best time to prune, if you really want to do it just 100% accurate, is when those trees are dormant in March, generally in our areas. And that is because the trees are going to be coming out of dormancy fairly soon, and there will be that wound will not be open and exposed for a long period of time. So the other thought on that is prune whenever you have a pruner in your hands, because that's we all like to be idealistic, but sometimes we just need to be realistic. And sometimes if it's July and you have a branch that you continue to damage when you mow, don't wait until March to prune it. Take it off now.
Or if it continues to damage you when you mow.
Exactly. Yes. So the really honest answer on this is March is usually the best time, or when you can have that wound not be exposed very long. My staff is starting to go out right now, and they'll start doing their pruning right now. And it's okay, because it's better for me to prune now than not prune at all and have co-dominant leaders and those types of things. So just really quickly, because I know we're running short of time, let's just talk about the tools that we want to use when we're pruning. So the first thing is that you want to have good pruners. And what I have in my hand is a bypass pruner. See how the blades bypass each other? That's what you want to use for live tissue pruning. If you're pruning dead branches, you can use an anvil pruner, and that's where the two blades come together and it just crushes the tissue. And that we don't use anvil pruners at all when we're doing any of our pruning. So what you want to do is you first go to the tree, assess what kind of form you want to have. I'm not going to get into that today. That would be for another day. And frankly, there are some amazing resources out there. Ed Gilman put together a book that's called Pruning. That is phenomenal. A lot of our extension organizations have great literature. The universities are putting it out. I think that if you Google pruning, you can find really good information as long as you're getting it from a university organization or the International Society of Arboriculture. Those would be some great places. So since I think what we need to talk about quickly is that let's just work today on making a good pruning cut. There are a couple different kinds of pruning cuts. There is a removal cut where here's the trunk of your tree and you would remove the branch from the tree. That's called a removal cut. Now you can do a reduction cut where you would come and maybe you have this big long branch here that's just kind of out of whack and you just want to reduce it. You would take that to what we call a node. See where is that clear or not clear?
There it is.
Cleared up, yes.
There we go. This is called a node right here. In where the branch grows to the next branch is called a node. In between that is called the inner node. That's this little area right here. So if we were going to do a reduction cut, we would go right above the node and at an angle because you want the water to kind of run off. You don't want it to sit. And what I'm looking for is I don't want to cut, sorry, everybody. I don't want to cut into that little branch, but I don't want to leave a big old stub clear out here. That's called a heading cut. Do you know what'll happen here is that all of a sudden, all these little sprouts will start to grow from that cut and it will cause you a big issue down the road. What you want to do is go right above your node at an angle. Don't cut into it. Don't cut way into the branch. You want to, I'm sorry, everybody. Take it off right there. And notice, that's a bad view. We'll wait for it to focus. That's a pretty good cut. Now, that's a reduction cut. Now, this would be a removal cut. And this is where it gets super important. There is so much amazing stuff that happens between the trunk of the tree and a branch. The branch and the trunk grow layers of wood on top of each other. And there's this really cool place right here called the branch bark ridge. And there's all of this wonderful chemical activity and cell division that takes place here so that when a branch is removed properly, you can have that cell division and it will seal over the wound more quickly and it will reduce your insect and disease risk. If you cut too close in here, if I just go straight and make this look like a straight tree, I'm going to cut a lot of that very special area off. And the tree is going to have a really hard time sealing over that wound. If I cut too far out, let's say if I cut it out there, then we're going to have all those little sprouts again. And that's going to be really detrimental for the tree because we'll have to come back in another year and remove all these funky little branches. So what you want to do, I'll see if I can, that looks pretty good. Here's our branch bark ridge. And you want to actually cut it at an angle. And hold on, let me get my pruners holding them correctly.
You need an assistant.
I did. And, they're all given COVID immunizations today. Otherwise, we'd be doing great today. Notice that this is not a straight. Notice how there's a little bit of a bump right here. That's okay. I know that for some people that might drive them crazy, but the tree is eventually going to callus over. It's for sure going to callus over and it will grow. And you're not even going to see that little, that cut in a few years. So that was just a really quick, do it super fast pruning cut. Sorry about that. And the motion sickness that I just gave everybody. So there you go.
No, that was No, and what great information. And the biggest thing is pruning is an extensive practice, right? It is something that is trained, takes years of experience, and you need to get some training. So I don't think we're going to spend a whole lot of time on that. So the last little thing to finish up our show, let's talk about planting. So we're going to be getting into March, April, May time here in the spring, and people might want to replace a tree or might want to expand their trees on their property or that. So let's dive into a little bit more about how to best plant a tree.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip through some of my images. What I have right in front of us is I want to make sure that everybody knows there's several steps in planting a tree. You don't just go to your local nursery and just because it's on Arbor Day and you just need to plant a tree. There needs to be some thought that's put into it. So you want to pick a good location. You want to prep the site before you go out. You need to look up above, make sure there's no power lines. You need to make sure you need to call before you dig, and make sure that you get all those locates taken care of. But then you need to pick out a high quality plant. These images that I have before me this is my park board. We do an evaluation in our Arboretum every year where we go and look at things. This is an oak that's been there for about 8 years. And we went up to it to assess it and we leaned on it and it tipped. And we thought, what the heck is going on? And what we discovered is we had some damaged bark, but as we looked more closely, we noticed that we have this huge circling root around the tree. And this is always so disappointing to us when we see these things because we have this investment of time that if we don't get that big circling root cut, that we will lose this tree because it will girdle the trunk or that tree will snap off in a windstorm. So what we really want to focus on is high quality root systems. And what you'll see on the left is a tree that's been grown in a good root production method where we have all these beautiful white roots that indicates that it is healthy and growing vigorously. That's one of the things that you want to look for. And I always say, if you go to a nursery, ask them to pop it out of the pot to see if you can look at their roots. If they don't want to do it, you probably don't want to buy your tree there because you need to inspect those roots like you want to inspect underneath the hood when you're buying a car. Down here on the right, this is what we generally see when we're buying trees. All of these roots that are growing in a circle, and honestly, the trees are buried way too deep in the containers. And so we hardly have any true root. We're going to have to come in here and cut all of that root off. So buying a good quality plant in the first place is your first step in doing it well.
So Amy, are you supposed to ask permission to pop the pots off? Because if I'm buying a tree, I'm popping them off anyway.
Well, I'm a rule follower, Jeff. So I always like to, but I can't speak for all the nurseries, but I think it would be best, especially if you're pulling them, because a lot of them will do a pot and pot system. So if you're pulling them out of the ground and taking the drip line off, that might tick them off a bit if you don't check with them first. So so quickly, because I know we're running out of time, keys to planting trees properly is you want to dig. And actually, let me just skip that picture because that is not how I roll. I never dig the hole first. I always take the plant out of the pot, and see where my first lateral root is. So notice all the soil on top of here. I usually pull all of this soil off until I find a root and when I start to see that there is a little bit of shear. Shear's not the right word. Why can't I think of it? Flare. Thank you. Flare. Okay. Flare. And when I can see that, and then when I find a root that's about the size of my thumb, I say, okay, that's where our first lateral root finally is. You guys will be deceived often because you'll see this little grouping of roots and you'll think, oh, this is our first lateral root. And it's actually adventitious roots that have grown above the root flare because there's so much moisture in soil. So the tree is like, sweet, I can get better resources up here. So it throws out a root that really has no place being there. So this is what happens. We take all of the soil off till we find those first lateral roots. Notice that beautiful root flare that we're starting to see right here. look how much soil we took off. If we didn't take that soil off and we planted it that deep, that tree is destined for failure. You don't have enough oxygen exchange for the roots. You'll start to get a lot of circling roots that'll grow up here. It'll just be a hot mess. So you really have got to do a lot of work before you even think about digging a hole. So initially we thought that we were going to dig a 15-inch hole, but in actuality, we're only digging a 3 to 4 inch hole. And my say is, why work harder than you need to? So
exactly.
Yes. So the next thing is, and this isn't even a very good picture, but if my root ball is 15 inches wide, I want my planting hole to be at least 30 inches wide, because I want it to be twice the size of the root ball, because I want to replace soil around the roots, and I want to be able to spread those roots out as much as I can to help it anchor a little bit. And I want a lot of oxygenation in there because the roots will grow more quickly.
So that's your answer, Amy. Why dig it any deeper when you have to dig it that much wider?
Amen. I know. And my take is, the more grass you can get rid of, the better. So notice the way it's planted, it's still sitting too deep in the hole. So if you accidentally dig it too deep, you'll need to add a little bit of soil and mound it and compact it a little bit on the bottom. Here's a great image of why wider is better. And out here where our soils are a little bit heavier in places, now in Goshen County, I know that they have some sand, so this wouldn't be as relevant, but in our heavier clay soils and silty soils and gearing, I actually plant that first lateral root about an inch above the native soil line, and then I kind of flare soil away from it like this. Because it's better for me to have it a little too high than too deep. So let's see here. Basically, what you want to do then is, this is whenever you're planting, I always stick a hose down in here and I put it on a trickle, and I fill that, oops, sorry, everybody. I fill that entire bowl with water after I've applied the soil. The water will settle that, and then I will be able to add just the right amount of soil on top so that the soil line is not too high, and it's not, and then sometimes I want to make sure that my roots aren't too exposed as well. That's a super fast description. I would recommend to anybody, if you have the opportunity to go to a tree planting training put on by Wyoming Forestry or anybody in Extension, take advantage of it. Tree planting is not as simple as we think it is. And I always say trees don't die when we kill them. So you might plant a tree and think that you're a super successful tree planter because it lives for 5 years, and then it starts to kind of decline and you're like, oh, it must be a disease. But it's actually poor planting practices in the beginning that have caused its decline.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. And yeah, and I think that goes for pruning as well. You know, again, these are practices that it does take a little bit of skill and some training and knowledge to do it. So if you don't have that, reach out. Your neighbors are always a good resource, but please seek out that resource that can provide you the professional knowledge and training with it. So that's fantastic. Jenny's been busy in the chat box, if you haven't seen that, posting up some articles and things like that. So please look into that. With that, is there any other thoughts that you have to close this program, Amy, before I wrap us up?
I don't. I just I would encourage people to use your Forest Service, your Extension people as resources. They're amazing people. They only want you to be successful. And you have a lot of time this winter to do some planning to be very successful for the spring. And so take advantage of all the great resources that have been put out there. I think that it'll be well worth your time, and you will have healthy, long-lived trees if you follow their recommendations.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. We can't thank you enough for your time and all your expertise in this. This was a great program. We just ran short. We had a lot to cover, and
we might have to have you back.
Yeah, we might have to have you back for another round, round 2 of tree care, right? But
Sounds good.
this was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. We want to thank all of our participants. Thank you so much for joining us. We got a few things for you to wrap this up here. So if you enjoyed this show, please check out the future shows. We're going to be doing this every Friday from now until the end of April, 10 a.m. Join us on Zoom. If you're not near a computer and can't join via Zoom, join us on Facebook Live on your phone. Make sure it's okay with the boss, right? So, but join us. If you're not able to join us, we're going to record the shows just like this one. We're going to post it back up so you can find where the schedule is by going to Barnyards and Backyards website. Jenny's going to share that link with you. We have a great lineup this spring. Check out those shows. If you missed one, go back to this website and the recorded show is going to be posted there for you. And then on top of it, the resources and links that the presenter or that Jenny has available to the topic of the show is also going to be there available to you with the recording. The other thing is, Amy said, reach out to those professionals, the Forest Service, Wyoming State Foresters, extension offices. And so with that, here is the county extension offices in Wyoming. We have one in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And so look up your local extension office. We're here to help you. And that's what we're here for, is to connect you with the resources so you can be successful. And the last thing I want to leave you with is Jenny has shared a link in the chat here on Zoom and then on the comments and Facebook, and it's for an evaluation. And so we just want to hear back from you. Was this useful for you? How are you going to use that knowledge? And that feedback is critical for us to understand how well we're doing with this program and make it more targeted to help you. And that's why we're doing this. We're doing it for you. And so we need your help and guidance to make this show as relevant as possible for you. But with that,
along with that link, it should also, if everything works well, it might pop up in your browser when you leave the webinar. So if you take a moment to fill that out, we'd be really thankful.
Right. Thank you so much, Jenny. I forgot about that part of it. And it's simple. It's really a short survey, a click, 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 type, and you're done kind of survey. So please fill that out. But with that, we're done. Thank you again so much, Amy, for your time. Jeff, it's always a pleasure to be with you and Jenny on this. You guys have a good rest of your Friday.
Good to see you guys. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.